Hi, I'm Candace Hunter from Practical Herbalist. I wanted to talk to you for a few moments today about making infusions. There's only one herbal medicine technique that you ever really learned or mastered. Making a good infusion would probably be the most powerful one. In part, that's because water is so easily accessible. We use this as human beings as our primary herbal medicine for centuries. It was all we had. And you know what? It works really well. So the first type of herbal infusion would be the hot infusion. It's essentially the same thing as making a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. There's a couple of important differences though if you're using herbal medicine, especially if you're looking for the medicinal qualities. The first piece is that for herbal medicine, we use a higher water temperature than we do for coffee or tea. For herbal medicine, we want to use water that's hit the boil or has just been boiled or is just at a boiling point. In part because it's really, really hot and that does a much better job of cracking the cell structure in your plant material, especially if you're using dried plant material. The second difference is that we typically let herbal medicine stand longer in the hot water than we would with a coffee or a tea. Coffee and tea have a lot of bittering properties. The longer you let them stand in hot water, and the hotter water you use, the more bitter you're going to have your final brew be. And typically for coffee and tea, like black teas or green teas, we're doing it for enjoyment. We're not doing it as an herbal medicine. On the other hand, a lot of herbal plants, like chamomile, for instance, do really, really well at the higher temperatures. They don't have nearly as much of the unpleasant bitter flavors to them or tannic properties that makes them unpleasant if you use the higher temperatures and the longer steeping time. When you want to steep it for a long time, you're going to be looking at about 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to an hour. You could go until the water cools off if you want, and I've done that to good effect. But the point is longer, more than just a couple of minutes. You're looking at 10 minutes or more steeping. So when you get started, I want you to consider using this process.
We're going to do some tea today. Notice it's 16 ounces or 2 cups, which is approximately half a liter or 500 milliliters for the total cup. We're going to be filling it up to 12 ounces, which will be approximately, I believe it's 400 milliliters. We'll take a look when we're done. To make a hot infusion, just by volume, we're going to use, notice this is kind of a fluffy tea here. We're going to use 2 of these. This one has some chamomile, some chrysanthemum, and some lychee berries. So it'll be nice and cooling for the summer. As we pour the water, I have water that's just boiled here. As we pour it, you notice how we're making sure everything gets really well covered. And we're going to go up to about 12 ounces. And then we'll cover that and let that stand.
All right, so you saw how it looks to get started, and you saw how the water started to change color really quickly. You saw how we made sure that we wetted all the plant material. That's really important, especially for herbal medicine making, because some of the plants can float on the top and they won't absorb the water. And if the water doesn't get in there, it's not going to extract any properties. So when you get ready to strain it, it should look like this.
Okay, we've been letting this steep for about 10 minutes. There we go. And I don't know if you can see that, but it says 300. It's actually 350 milliliters. Right there, 350. I said 400 before. So anyway, you'll notice how the herbs are, some of them are up at the top and some of them have fallen. Okay. Push that into there. Now, when you're looking at the herbs, you'll notice how fluffy and light and squishy everything is. When it's steeped plenty of time, it'll be pretty squishy. Compare that with these dried herbs that are pretty. You can see that just even looking at them, you can see the difference. And you can see the color change.
All right, so you saw how the water had changed its color significantly, and you also saw how the plant material had a different look. The texture is much squishier. Those are both two really important points for recognizing when you've let your hot infusion steep long enough. When you're doing a hot infusion, you're going to be using 1 to 2 tablespoons, kind of about a handful. If your plants are more dense and less fluffy, then you might use a little bit more. If they're fluffier, or a little bit less rather, if you're fluffier, you use a little bit more. That weighs out to being somewhere in the neighborhood of like 50 to 30 grams or so of plant material. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about dried. You can do a hot infusion with fresh plant material as well. Probably going to use more because it's already got a lot of liquid in it. So play with it a little bit. The more plants you use, the more strong the flavor is going to be. There was one time when I did a hot infusion for someone and I used 3 tablespoons of dried peppermint. And I can tell you that that was not a pleasant drink. And that person took a few sips and politely set it aside. And I did not blame her when I later realized what I had done. So the amount of plant material really will dictate how medicinal your final tea or herbal infusion tastes. The second type of herbal infusion we often use is a cold infusion. Cold infusions are sometimes called moon tea, they can be called sun tea, sweet tea, solar tea. The essence of it is you take your plant material, you put it in, you cover it with water that's room temperature or cold, or cooler anyway, not heated water. And then you let it stand like this.
For cold infusion, we're going to use a mixture of dried herbs. So what we have here today is some oat straw, rose petals, and some linden, which is smaller, harder to see. And then I also substituted, this is the Heart Resilience Tea by Rebecca Ingalls, and I did not have hawthorn berry or leaf, so I substituted a little bit of chamomile and a little bit of agrimony to help settle stomach and heart. So this is our blend. We're going to use approximately a half a cup of it. This is a very fluffy blend. You saw the oat straw is very fluffy, as are the rose petals. So I'm probably going to top it off a little bit heavier than I normally would. I'm going to go with the rest of this because it was very fluffy. So you have some leeway when you're doing this. A half a cup is about 120 milliliters for perspective. And take a look at how full that is. The quart is approximately a liter. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. So you notice how dry everything looks? Now we'll put our water in. Yeah, just like with hot, we want to cover everything. I'm going to do right up as close to the top as I can. There we go. I forgot to pull out my cover, but I'm going to put a cover on this and then I'll let it stand. One of the things I want you to notice is see how the herbs gather at the top here and all the water down there, and the water's very clear. So I hope you can see that. So you saw how we put the water in, but there wasn't a color change in the water immediately. You also saw it's important, one of the important pieces is to make sure that you do wet all of that plant material as quickly or as much as you can, as much as you can as you're filling the water in there. So you let it stand, and you're going to let it stand for somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 hours, maybe a day. If you do longer than that in a hot climate, you stand a chance of having your infusion begin to ferment, which is not necessarily desired. It's not the good kind of fermenting. So I recommend doing it shorter steeping. If you are living in a cooler climate or like it's wintertime, then steeping it for a longer time, you could go maybe as much as a day. Once you strain your plant material, it'll look like this. This is the cold infusion we started a few hours ago. You can see how the plant material is expanded. It started off, it was going just right down to about there in the bottle, or in the jar, and it's gone down to further. You can also see the color change. Oh, hopefully you can see that. The color change is an important way of telling that your cold infusion has done its job, and the expansion of the plant material also is a good key indicator. Although if you start with fresh plant material instead of dried plant material, it won't expand as much. So one of the features of cold infusions is that you can let your herbs continue to stand in the water. So I'm not going to strain these out. In fact, I'm going to tap back in everything that we had taken out and set that aside. So here's my strained infusion. I'm going to note that there's a lot of plant in there, and I want you to take a good look at that. You see how not fine my strainer is? That'd be why. So the finer the strainer you have, the better off.
So you saw how when we strained the plant material, the water had changed its color significantly. The plant material had expanded. We started with dried plants. You can make a cold infusion starting with fresh plants. They won't expand in size and shape as much, but the water will change. And that's a key piece for cold infusions, and recognizing the change in the color of the water. That gives you a big indicator that your cold infusion is ready to go. I typically use somewhere in the neighborhood of a half a cup or 120 milliliters or so of dried plant material. For fresh plant material, I'd probably double that. And if the plants are very fluffy, like the rose petals and the oat straw that I used for this particular infusion, I will end up using more. I might double it. So I might use closer to a cup or 240 milliliters of dried plant material in that case. So the third type of infusion has been long called a decoction. I also think of it as a long infusion because it takes a long time to make if you want to do it properly. Long infusions or decoctions are usually used for plant material that's very hard, either when it's fresh or when it's dry. I'm talking about the barks, the roots, the really hard berries, those tough plant parts. They don't break down very easily or very quickly. So it's important to give the water time to get its job done, but it's also important to give the water heat so it can have a better chance of breaking the plant cells and opening up the plant properties. So that looks like this.
We're going to do a decoction today, and I wanted to show you one really important thing about decoctions. So we're going to be using hawthorn berries and elderberries, and we're going to be using burdock. And I wanted to show you the difference. We're using roots and berries, and they're very small, dry, hard, compact. I wanted to show you the difference between, this is burdock root. This is 20 grams of burdock root, dried. It's right there. And you can see how much is in there. This is wood betony tops, also 20 grams dried. It's much fluffier, so you'll notice that it takes up a lot more space. So that's important when you're making your decoctions. The wood betony, we're not going to use. I am going to, however, finish topping off my burdock. Didn't use whey, I decided to go with volume. So we have about a half a cup, which is approximately 120 milliliters for each of these. For reference, if you're weighing, this whole blend of essentially 1.5 cups of the roots and berries comes out to approximately 150 to 200 grams of dried plant material, dried herbs. So I'm going to use the crock pot method. So we have our little crock pot, pour them in. Now this is going to be a strong decoction. You'll notice that it is about that much, filling about that much of the bottom of the pot. So it gives you a perspective on approximately how much you're going to use for the amount of water that you use. And I'm going to pour the water in. This is 2 liters, or approximately 2 quarts. Now, it's about a thumb below length of the first digit, so that's approximately an inch, which, if I remember correctly, is 2.5 centimeters. I might be wrong on that. So notice how it's dry. You can see everything looks somewhat dry in there. So we're just going to cover that, and we'll put it on the heat.
So when we do a decoction, we won't necessarily see a ton of change in the plant material after we strain it. Watch this.
This is the decoction that we started yesterday, our long infusion. It took about 12 hours. I don't know if you can see in the lighting, You can see there's little chunks of burdock that have taken on the color of the elderberry right there. And then we have some hawthorn. You can see how the hawthorn, here we go, there's one. You see how the hawthorn will actually squish? If you've ever used hawthorns, you'll notice when they're dry, they're very hard. And then the elderberries are in there, and they're still in there. So that was about 12 hours, and I've strained it through this bag, which is a straining bag. It's like a nut milk bag. It helps to keep everything together. It makes it easier to squish everything out. So hopefully you can see the squishing, squeezing. You're going to want to squeeze as much as you can. I'm probably not going to do all of it right here. So for now, I'm going to set it aside. I'll come back later on and finish squeezing. But I've got most of it out. I don't know if you can see, but we started right here is the 2-liter mark. That's where the water was when we filled it up. And now you can see it's down by, a good thumb's worth. When it was in the crock pot, it was also down by about, we started off, or went down an extra like half an inch to an inch, somewhere in there. So we concentrated it some. If you want to concentrate it further, you could at this point now put it back into the crock pot and let it sit overnight for a day or even 2. I've done 3 on occasion on high heat so that it will slowly simmer away without really cooking at a higher temperature. So it just steams away.
So you saw how there was a huge change in the color of the water, but there was not a ton of change in the texture and the feel of the plant material. There was a little bit. The hawberries, when we put them in there, they were like rock hard, if you've ever worked with those. But after decocting that was a day, I think that was 12-hour of decoction or 12 hours of long infusion, at least the outer covering of them was squishy. So the differences between when you put it in and when you're done are more subtle than they are when you're using cold or long infusions because of the nature of the herbs that you're using. Usually for a long infusion, I'll use somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 grams worth of plant material. And that comes out to be about 5 or 6 ounces or so of plant material. It's significantly smaller than in volume than if I was doing plant upper parts. So nettles or oat straw or bottle brush that I might put into a decoction, they're going to take up more space for a larger volume for the amount of weight that they have. You don't have to weigh it out, but for me, it makes it easier. For about 2 to 3 quarts worth of crock pot style or on the stove style decoction or long infusion, you're going to use about a half a cup of each of your herbs. Aiming for somewhere in the neighborhood of a cup and a half to 2 cups finished, depending on the formula you're using and what your intended purposes are. The nice thing about a long infusion or decoction also, especially if you're using like a crock pot, if you use the crock pot, you can walk away from it. You can let it, continue to cook on high or low for several days. If you're using a stovetop, you're going to want to watch it a lot more. Once you strain the plant material out, you can concentrate it further, your finished infusion further, by putting it back on the heat for a while longer and reducing it in volume. That's the essence of how tea pills or tea concentrates are made for Chinese medicine. And if you've got someone who's going to have a hard time, drinking a half a cup worth of really bitter or unpleasant flavored infusion, then concentrating it so it's only a quarter cup, it's like 1 shot, get it down, that might make it easier for them to take it. So that would be one of the potential reasons for wanting to concentrate your long infusion more so. So those are our 3 types: hot infusion, cold infusion, long infusion. I typically use hot infusions a lot more in the wintertime when it's cold, and especially when an illness has come up, because oftentimes the warmth is helpful. I usually use cold infusions through the summer, although I have been at times use them in the winter as well, especially when I want to make sure that my final brew has very little bitter flavor to it. Long infusions are ones that I reach for through the winter typically, but they also do really well when I know that I need to get some barks and roots in, like make a root beer for a spring cleanse, or going into winter, building up the system by making some bone broth with added shiitake and bottle brush and other herbs that will help be very nutritive. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you have fun making your herbal infusions today.